Good morning to you all. That's okay. Welcome to this session where we will dive today into the interesting subject of public procurement legislation. Myself, I am Bart Zoete. I am working as a lawyer for the government of Flanders, and I'm a lawyer who is specialized in public procurement. So our contribution today has the slightly provocative title, maybe, Mandatory Procurement Requirements, Effective Policy Making or Naive Interventionism. So, I think all of you are aware that public procurement has become a lot more than a simple regulated administrative process in recent years, or should I say recent decades. We can all agree that today public procurement represents a more complex and multi-layered regulatory instrument. Why is that, you may ask? Well, I think it's quite obvious. Each year, a huge amount of public funds are transferred to public procurement. You can see it on the slide. I'm not sure everyone knows the exact numbers, but it is estimated at about 14% of the European GDP. So we're talking 2,000 billion euros each year. So I think it's quite clear that public procurement is an important market. So this means that if we would gather all European public buyers in this room, that would never fit, I guess, but if we would gather them all, they represent a huge buying power. So policymakers are convinced we should use that buying power to shape or reshape the market. I think we can all agree that public procurement can be an important lever for spending public money more efficiently, contributing to a more innovative, sustainable, inclusive and competitive economy. Well, let's talk about ambitions. Okay. So yes, we know that in recent years, EU public procurement law has made a shift from being facilitative with guidings or guidances and toolboxes to being more prescriptive. Okay. So this is where mandatory criteria come into play. By mandatory criteria, we mean criteria that are embedded in law and are applicable to all public buyers. So in recent years, we have seen some trends. I can refer to the batteries regulation, the proposal for a regulation on heavy-duty vehicles, and of course, not to forget the Net Zero Industry Act, which we will look into further on. So why can this be an effective approach using mandatory criteria? Well, of course, it can help with leading to a certain standardization in the market. It can help public buyers with the technical complexity, which is kind of important in the day-to-day processes of public procurement. And it can also raise the bar by setting ambitious goals, ambitious targets. So that sounds good, don't you think? But there's a big but. Markets are complex systems. And as we all know, complex systems are full of interdependencies and non-linear responses. So, as the quote says, under opacity, you do not mess with such a system. You do not mess with it. So, we all know that intervening can result in big benefits, but also in big drawbacks, and everything in between, maybe. This also reopens the age-old discussion whether legislation and mandatory requirements should only apply to public procurement or to the whole economy. So we must be well aware, if we draft specific legislation for public procurement, it can lead to a division in the market. It can also reduce the economies of scale, and it can create new barriers for new companies who want to bid for public contracts. So we must be well aware of the risks of mandatory requirements as well. So the big question, and I'm not sure we will be able to answer that question today, but we will try, is on which level and how to intervene and what the possible benefits, drawbacks and costs will be. Now, in an attempt to structure the debate, we have defined 3 levels of regulation. Of course, the highest level is regulation by law. Because yes, the requirements are embedded in the law and they are possibly applicable to all public buyers. Then we have regulation by standardization, which is also called technocratic regulation. Things like standardization, certification, accreditation, and normalization are all part of this trend. So this kind of regulation can be interesting, but we must also be aware that it can hollow out general principles of public and private law. So, of course, it gives rise to questions of legitimacy. And then we have regulation by contract. That's the lowest level, but it's an important level. Now, regulation by contract, it assigns the regulatory role to the public buyer, to the individual public buyer. So this puts an important responsibility on the public buyer's shoulders. And there are certain limits, of course, in the regulatory role an individual public buyer can play. So the big question is, on which level do we want to impose procurement requirements, and do we have to alter the approach depending on the level? This is quite obvious. The higher the level, the higher the potential, and the higher the total impact. But, of course, the higher the level, the less agile. It's slower to change. There's a legislative procedure which takes time. It's more difficult to change because you have to consult a lot of stakeholders. So the higher the level, the higher the potential impact, but the more difficult it is as an instrument to change and to respond to a changing society and to respond to innovation. We also must admit that the empirical evidence on the effectiveness and efficiency of regulations is rather limited. So that's a reality. Just to give you an idea, we'll have a short look into the Net Zero Industry Act. This is the first proposal, so we can criticize this one because the text has substantially changed in recent months. But if we look at the Article 19 of the first proposal of the Net Zero Industry Act, it says that contracting authorities shall base the award of the contract for net zero technology, we're talking like heating pumps and solar panels, so they will base the award of contracts on the best price quality ratio. That's okay, that's something we all know. But then it proposes some criteria we can use, like you can read it on the slide. The impact and the quality of the implementation plan, including risk management measures, the contribution to the energy system integration, and last but not least, the contribution to resilience. Well, to be honest, that's not very easy for public buyers. So it can have a substantial impact, but it may also limit opportunities, creativity and innovation for procurers, because the set of criteria you can use is quite limited. And it may be difficult or costly to comply for procurers. I'm not sure how easy it is to evaluate things like contribution to resilience or contribution to the energy system integration. That's quite complicated, I must admit. It's also, in the execution of the contract, difficult to monitor and difficult to enforce those criteria. And there's also the risk that the market converges to a certain point or standardizes, and then there's the risk that the award criterion loses its differentiating power, which is essential for those award criteria. So yes, I think the European Commission is well aware of those risks, and so there has been an amended version in November, which was, to be honest, even more complicated. But I understand that in the last weeks there has been some amendments as well, so it's going the right way, I hope.
Thank you, Bart, for the explanation on the level, on which level to intervene. Now, maybe a more important question, or an equally important question, is how to intervene. because there's multiple ways you can impose mandatory criteria for public procurement. We didn't invent this terminology, it's coming from the literature. The first thing you can do concerning mandatory public procurement criteria is a substantive approach. A good example of a substantive approach would be to make a sort of a technical specification requiring 50% bio-based content in the procured goods. That would be a very concrete technical specification. You can also have predefined award criteria, for example, like in the Net Zero Industry Act. Then another way to imposing mandatory sustainability criteria or innovative criteria is a procedural approach. This approach leaves more discretionary margin to procurers and to lower policy levels. So it's not really a detailed technical specification or a detailed award criterion, but it's more like a general duty or a comply or explain system where the contracting authority can opt out of the system if they have a specific motivation for it. And then the third one isn't really a criterion in itself, but it's a way on imposing certain targets to member states or contracting authority. So you don't impose a specific technical specification, award criterion, selection criterion, but you just say on a certain level, maybe on an EU member state level or on the level of the contracting authority, a certain target has to be met. The beautiful thing about targets is that you leave a lot of room for procurers to organize themselves. So it gives more weight to innovation, we think. But there's also quite a lot of difficulties with targets. For instance, how do you decide how to monitor such a target? And how do you decide on how to impose the target? You can work with percentages of financial volumes. You can work in percentages of normal volumes. You can say, for instance, if you buy